Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello, everybody. Back again for another episode of the FIA Group's Empowering Plans Podcast. I am still Ron Peck, Executive Vice President and General Counsel with the FIA Group. With me again is Brady Bizarro. Brady, how you doing, buddy? You okay?
Hanging in there.
Hanging in there. You know what? I feel like every time we talk, you sound just a little bit more fatigued than the last time. We've also got Nick Bonds on the line. Hey, Nick, you're back again. How you doing, buddy?
Doing all right. I'm doing all right.
Seriously, right? I mean, and if that's you, so I know that you and Brady are both really into the whole political scene. And, you know, Nick, I don't think you maybe to the same degree. I know Brady, he takes the day off before Election Day. He takes the week off afterward. You know, Brady, I don't know how to tell you this. As an attorney, I would think that you should know anything you post to social media is no longer confidential and is out there. So when you're sending videos out to all of, you know, your friends and anyone who happens to know your friends like me, because I wouldn't count myself among those lucky people, but, you know, we're going to see those videos that you're sending out there of your room at home with the 12 monitors all set up, each with a different newscast and the ticker tape and everything else in your, what would you call it, the war room?
The war room, that's right.
Yeah, you didn't know that was out there. Yeah, it is. There you go. So, you know, you would think now, Brady, over the years, you've invested a lot of time and energy into elections, into Election Day. And, you know, similar to the Super Bowl or New Year's Eve or something like that, there's a buildup, it happens, and then it's over. And you take a couple of days to recover, and you're done, right? But in this case, you've made the mistake of latching your emotional and physical well-being to an event that pretty much seems to have no end.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
You know, that's where we're at. At every few elections now, we keep hearing how this is the most important election in our lifetimes, and it seems like this is also going to be probably the longest one as well, because we still don't quite know exactly what's going to happen, although, you know, we have a declared winner by most of the media, and if you look on paper, at this point, you know, President-elect Joe Biden has won the majority of these swing states, but who knows? We don't quite have a resolution, as weird as that is to say.
Man, Brady, I'm so sorry, buddy. Listen, if I were you, I would attach my emotional sort of investment into something less stressful, like, I don't know, rocket science or brain surgery. But, you know, that's just me. So, all right. So what do we know? What's the update since, you know, we did our last podcast yesterday? What's going on?
Well, a couple important things, and I'll let Nick speak to a bit about what the Biden transition team is doing, because they are hard at work, regardless of the uncertainty that we're facing. But look, a couple important things have happened since we last spoke, which feels like it was a couple hours ago, but I think it was a couple days ago. One is that we kind of know at this point now that the president is going to be challenging these results of the election. He's directed the Department of Justice to investigate potential voter fraud. We'll have to look and see how that all plays out. But it's clear that politically speaking, the Republicans have not really come out in support of President-elect Joe Biden. So at the moment, we're kind of up in the air. Typically what happens in this period after an election is the transition team will be preparing to assume power, and the current administration would be signing all the paperwork and getting everything done that has to get done administratively to make sure there's a smooth transition. But in this case, that's not happening. We know that the General Service Administration of Donald Trump has not actually signed the paperwork to allow for the transition process to start happening, I guess, in front of the scenes. But we know that behind the scenes, there are some things being done by the Biden administration or potential administration, because the reality is it's about 71 days, right, until he would take office, barring some unforeseen court intervention. So, Nick, I mean, what have you been seeing in terms of what the Biden transition team has been doing? It's only been a couple of days, but from what I'm seeing, it's quite a lot on the spectrum of healthcare.
Yeah, we're seeing, because of that reluctance you mentioned from the Trump administration to sort of acknowledge that the transition is happening, we've seen some fewer resources going to the Biden transition team than we would probably expect to see at this point. But they're still getting a lot of good work done. They're moving pretty aggressively to putting together a coronavirus response team. We saw yesterday that Biden announced his coronavirus task force, and obviously the pandemic response is going to be a major component of Biden's initial time in office here. We saw he appointed to that task force quite a few doctors, actually, which I think signifies the Biden team is going to be deferring a lot more to expert opinions, shall we say. They've got a lot of doctors. They've got, I think, a former Surgeon General. They've got a former FDA commissioner. And they've sort of already been making a lot of noise about how they're going to push back against the coronavirus. The biggest component of that is still just wear a mask. Biden himself is doing a lot to push and encourage mask wearing, and it's starting to have an effect. The governor of Utah was finally spotted wearing a mask, and he had been a mask holdout for quite a while. But they're pushing the mask wearing. They're also going to be doing a lot to beef up contact tracing and testing. But some of that is still going to be hindered by the congressional Congress if they can't get funding for it. So we're still waiting anxiously to see how the last bits of the election play out with those runoff elections for the Senate seats in Georgia. And we're going to have to see how willing the Congress is to work with Biden's team on the coronavirus response.
Okay, so we're talking now. That's politically, guys. At the same time, one of the other things that are sort of ongoing and relevant to our industry is the ACA lawsuit, and it's interesting that it's sort of all roads lead to the Supreme Court, right? The election is sort of being challenged in a legal capacity, but the ACA was there first. Right? What do we expect from that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ron, because literally as we speak, I believe oral argument is starting in the Supreme Court over the ACA case, which is now, as our listeners know, California v. Texas. So the first really part of that argument will be heard today. It might last a couple days, but we don't expect an actual resolution to that case until next spring. But that said, there are a couple of things we can, I think, take away from the court case and how it may play out, and as well as what President-elect Biden has been doing in the meantime. He's giving a speech today, actually, where he's going to be defending the ACA and making the case that, it should not be repealed. Now, we know as good lawyers, of course, that none of that should impact the analysis done by the Supreme Court, right, and how they decide. It should not be impacted by politics, of course. But the reality is, if the court, which is now heavily conservative in nature, if it does rule that the individual mandate cannot be separated from the rest of the law and does decide to throw the entire law out, that would be very, very disruptive to the system. Not only would 20 million people lose coverage basically overnight, but obviously we're in the middle of the pandemic still, and people are very reliant on their health care at this particular time. So I would be shocked to see the court take a drastic step in that direction, despite all that we've heard. I think for me, it's always been the case that a likely result here would be that the court severs the individual mandate from the rest of Obamacare, from the ACA. I think part of the reason I feel that way, not just because almost every other legal scholar on every side of the aisle feels that way, but the longer that this plays out, the longer the law sort of exists without the mandate, I think the weaker the argument is that the GOP has that the mandate is inseverable, right? If the mandate was so crucial to Obamacare, and it is very crucial, but if it was so crucial to the law that it couldn't function without it, then how is it that we've been functioning without it now for over a year, right? That's a tough question to answer if you're arguing that the entire law has to go. And I think that alone, will play into many of the justices' minds when they look and see what the intent of Congress was here, because that's the ultimate question. So again, we'll know more next spring, but I feel that the case, it's really the seventh time in 8 years that the ACA has been heard at the Supreme Court in a challenge. And I think it somehow will eke this one out as well and survive. Those are my thoughts.
So let's say we assume that it remains relatively intact and you have a health benefit plan. That health benefit plan needs to be ramping up to pay something known as a vaccine. So assuming that the plans are intact and survives this legal challenge, the next thing they need to prepare for is to pay for some vaccinations, or at least we hope. What are we hearing as far as the vaccine front is concerned?
Yeah, I'll jump in for this one. I think we've seen all recently the big news coming from Pfizer that their vaccine trial, they showed in early results, still early results, but they showed in early results that their vaccine trial was over 90% effective, which is at the very least massively encouraging news for the vaccine effort. I think previously Dr. Fauci had expressed that he would be pretty excited to see a vaccine that was just 60% effective, and if this vaccine, as more data comes in, if they can keep that effectiveness rate that high, that's going to be tremendous for the vaccination effort going forward. But as Ron was sort of alluding to, one of the requirements under the ACA for self-funded health plans is they have to cover preventative services, which would include this vaccine. And that could be an expense for a lot of plans that they're going to have to brace for, especially when we look at how this vaccine in particular is administered. It comes with quite a few logistical complications. It's a multiple dose vaccine, so you would have to, I think, take at least 2 doses of it to get to that 90% effectiveness. Also, the vaccine itself is fairly temperamental. It has to be kept extremely cold for transportation, which all of those logistical difficulties may factor into the ultimate price that self-funded plans are expected to pay for this vaccine farther down the line. And importantly, they won't be able to impose any sort of cost sharing for it. So it'll be an expense that's largely borne by the plans alone.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think, Ron, this is important to note. So the CARES Act is what clarified that self-funded plans would have to pay for the vaccine whenever it does come. And under the CARES Act here, according to the law, the U.S. Preventative Service Task Force gets to decide or make a recommendation about the effectiveness of a vaccine. And if they give that vaccine a grade of A or B, then that's enough to trigger the health plan's obligation to have to cover it. And so if, like Nick reported here, if the Pfizer vaccine is 90% effective, to me, that's an A. Maybe for some people it's a B, but it's at least going to be a B. And that would mean that plans would have to cover the cost. And if it's any indication, by the way, of what earlier treatments have cost, things like Regeneron or Remdesivir, you can bet that self-funded plans are going to have to pay a lot more than the government will have to pay. And so we don't know those figures yet, but I'm not very optimistic in terms of cost savings when the vaccine does come out.
Wow. Okay. So let's look then at the timing, and assuming that the vaccine becomes publicly available at or after the inauguration, assuming that President-elect Biden survives legal challenges levied against him by current President Trump. If hypothetically they wanted to achieve some sort of plan or effort or strategy to make it financially viable for these plans to survive the cost of just going from nothing to everything with the vaccine, what kind of potential strategies do we think could be attempted, or do you think politically, a chink in the armor when it comes to these private plans? If these plans can't afford to cover the vaccine, is that an opportunity to say this is a reason why? Again, if I'm President Biden, a public option makes sense. And again, I may be thinking a little too far down the line, and I've got my tinfoil hat on, but I'm always thinking, is there an opportunity to take a bad and make it into a good, at least from the perspective of Joe Biden and his administration, who, again, are trying to push a public option agenda, to say, hey, if a public option existed, everybody could afford this vaccine now. That's one issue. And then sort of along the same lines of that political questioning, what other sort of agenda items do you think he has? And particularly, you're already hearing now about some executive orders that he's hoping to push through. I know during our last podcast, we talked a little bit about how because the Senate, because the House are so sort of divided, he doesn't really have just the blank check to do whatever he wants from a legislative standpoint. Might he take the same sort of approach to these things as the current president, which is anywhere I can get around sort of that congressional gridlock, I'll attempt an executive order. So I know I threw a lot out there, guys, but I'm just kind of thinking, one, if the private plans can't afford this vaccine, does that add sort of a chip for Biden to play with, which is sort of a failure on the part of the private plans to take care of the American public? And then two, does that embolden him to push that and other executive orders that may be on his desk or his agenda?
I'll take a crack at that first one. I think that's absolutely right that, this might present an opportunity for those a bit further to the left to point out the potential flaws and weaknesses in the private market, in particular the employer sponsored market, especially in a time where we still don't have a COVID relief bill and we still have many people losing their job and then losing their coverage as a result of that. So I think there's an opportunity there for people on the left. I also think, though, like you said, in terms of the time frame, we still have a ways to go here. Speaking to the vaccine time table in particular, I know that when it is, whatever one is finally approved and released, which looks to be this Pfizer one, it's going to go first to healthcare workers, to first responders, to seniors and the elderly before the general public. So I think for the vast majority of self-funded plans and their plan participants, they don't have to worry about covering widespread, the people on their plans maybe until later into next year. But eventually we'll have to know what that's going to cost. And as far as ideas about what could be done to soften the blow, I mean, I would expect to see some kind of, or it'd be nice to see some kind of reimbursement program perhaps that might be authorized as part of the next COVID relief package. Or maybe the government will say, hey, you pick up the cost of the first shot, we'll pick up the cost of a second shot, or something along those lines. Because the reality is we in the industry know that whenever you hear that something is free for people, for people with self-funded plans or employer insurance, we know it's not really free because the plan has to pay the cost. So I thought it was funny the other day when the Pfizer CEO assured everyone, don't worry, the vaccine will be free for you. Again, free for them, but not free for their plans, right? Someone's got to pay, and it will have an impact on the plan if the price is outrageous. And so I think it's an opportunity there on the left. And also, I think also an opportunity for those who are making the case for prescription drug pricing reform if we see a price that's extremely high. So two things on that. And one last note before I'll turn it over to Nick. On the case of executive orders, I do expect the Biden administration to absolutely avail itself of executive orders the same way that President Trump did. I think first and foremost will be to restore a lot of what was undone with respect to the ACA. But I think one thing to remember, and I made this point, we can talk about it in more detail later on in other podcasts perhaps, but his executive orders will be checked by the courts. So don't forget that. The Trump administration, along with Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, has filled a lot of the federal bench, and they will be looking for presidents that try to exceed their executive authority, just like President Trump has done in the past. So I wouldn't be so sure that we'll get a ton of action on the executive front, or I wouldn't be resigned to the fact that a President Biden would go too far in many of those areas. What do you think, Nick?
I think you're probably right that we'll be seeing a lot of aggressive executive actions if Biden feels like he can't move things through Congress very efficiently. I think it's worth remembering that Biden worked pretty closely with Mitch McConnell in the Senate for quite a few years. So I think the two of them have a fairly robust working relationship at the very least. So I'm a little optimistic they'll be able to work together on some of these pressing issues like healthcare and pandemic response. But I do expect we'll see a decent number of executive orders coming out of the Biden White House. We'll probably see executive orders on a few big fronts. We'll see executive orders to do things like rejoining the WHO. We'll see more funding for things like cancer research. We'll see pushes to have more of the FDA in the driver's seat when it comes to pandemic response. But we could also see moves on smaller scale things. Like I know that the Biden team is fairly hostile to some of the non-Obamacare coverage that the Trump administration is trying to push. So we could see them trying to rein in things like short-term limited disability insurance. We could see them moving against association health plans, things like that, and trying to rein in some of the Section 1332 state waivers to kind of let states come up with new innovative ideas. We could see a lot of moves like that kind of nudge the ball a little bit towards the more progressive direction. But I think you're absolutely right when you say that there's a pretty robust conservative judiciary that the Biden administration is going to have to contend with. So they're going to have to be fairly restrained in their application of executive orders.
Okay, so basically what you're telling me is we're kind of in a wait and see period of time, which is unfortunate because speaking at least for the health benefits industry, we're at renewal. People are renewing their plans. It's nice to know in October, November, December, what we're going to have to deal with in the coming year. But I think we've come to appreciate that politics tends to be on a calendar year. So unfortunately, all we can do at this point is just make our best estimate, what we can expect to see, and do our best to at least leave the canvas blank or open for us to hopefully make updates as needed that won't be too disruptive. But, as always, all we can do at this point is wait and see and stay tuned in. So, on I think behalf of myself and everyone in the industry, I thank the two of you in particular for keeping your eyes open and ears to the ground. And also, I'm grateful to the other industry voices. We've been attending a few webinars and podcasts lately on this topic and gaining information from them as much as they take, we get. So, we got to work together as a team on this one. So on behalf of myself, the FIA group, the entire industry, and this team that we call our industry, thank you so much for, again, tuning into the Empowering Plans podcast with the FIA group. Be well.